Hello everyone, you're watching Ukrainer, and my name is Julia Tymoshenko, and this is our series where we talk about our uncertain future with different thinkers, political experts from Ukraine and around the world. And today we're returning to a conversation that we started actually 2 years ago, but some great conversations you want to continue, so that's why we're having Peter Pomerantsev back, who is a British academic, senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, and the award-winning author of now 3 influential books on disinformation and propaganda. And I know that the 4th one is also coming. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but
no, go for it.
I'm sure a lot of our readers and viewers have heard about Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. This is not propaganda, and most recent book, How to Win an Information War. I want to start by something that's everybody's been talking for a few weeks now. Obviously, the whole war in the Middle East has shook the world and shifted attention, you would say, as Ukrainians love to describe these kind of conflicts that now emerge post-22 world, where, we have these different axes, but now, America is also more, influential and acts with Trump in a different way than it had during Biden. But it's interesting to look at how Trump and his team talk about the war in Iran, and it's hard not to make comparison with Russia's rhetoric around the war in Ukraine. The lack of justification and actual goals for describing the reason to start the war, the inability to recognize mistakes, the kind of this desire to say that we're winning all the time, although the reality somewhat looks different. What are some most striking similarities between those rhetorics for you, and what is still fundamentally different, in your opinion, how these two sort of talk about their wars?
That's interesting. I mean, I see what you're getting at. There's some superficial similarities, but overall, despite the kind of confusion at the start of 22, Russia has a very sophisticated and well-oiled propaganda machine that is thinking about every target audience and thinks in a very holistic way about what they call, information competition or information struggle, while America under Trump has abandoned all of its classic ways of communication, Voice of America, Starved Radio Free Europe, killed the bits of the State Department that would have done this strategically. And everything is just based around Trump and a couple of tech companies, kind of just improvising. So that's actually not very similar to Russia. I can think of other countries that's similar to. What is similar is something else. So, I'm at Johns Hopkins, have been analyzing polling of how some Americans think about foreign policy over the last few years. And it is very striking how some parts of MAGA think about and feel about the world in ways that are emotionally similar to a large part of the Russian population. So some of the most interesting polling that we have around how Russians feel about foreign policy was actually leaked at the start of the war. Yeah. And we had this fascinating moment when we saw how the Kremlin polls its own people. Yeah. What questions are they asking, and what are they trying to influence when they conduct foreign propaganda or propaganda about foreign affairs to the Russians? And essentially, what they were using was questions that are connected to a concept called collective narcissism, which is developed. It's actually a way of understanding German support for Nazis, but it was developed by many sociologists and a very famous academic at the University of London, who used it to understand essentially a people's feeling of supremacy to others, their feeling that they're victimized at the same time, and the endless yearning for respect. Yeah. And the Kremlin was analyzing these feelings in the Russian population at the start of the war, and instructing their propagandists to choose the messages that would strengthen that. So support for the war was correlated with the sense of collective narcissism. And you can hear it in Putin's speeches when he talks about finally the world will respect us, that we are greater than others, that others have been humiliating us and keeping us down. It's that kind of collective rhetoric, which when I did some polling of the Russian population, we found like over 55% of Russians were ready to buy into this. So at the same time, if you look at the polling of Trump supporters, they have a similar sense of the world. Yeah, a desire to feel great and superior to others, a feeling that they've been used and that they're actually a victim, and this endless and unsatisfiable desire for respect, which is just based on a personal sense of insecurity. So it's this kind of very toxic mix of victim narrative, superiority, which opens up and legitimizes violence, and an unsatisfiable desire for respect. So you see that rhetoric being used both in America and Russia, and the polling shows that's successful with their core bases. So in that sense, there is a similarity. In America, that percentage is much smaller. Yeah. While in Russia, it's a majority of the population.
When we look at the non-MAGA crowd in America with like everybody else, how would you assess their response to the war in Iran? Because some political commentators say that it's strikingly different from how it's been during Iraq war, Afghanistan, that the public is sort of disengaged on a large level and it's not as like actively resisting or talking about it in the same way it's been before. Again, this is subjective opinions of people that are sort of talking about this. So I wonder how you see this, and if you do see kind of like differences, what are the reasons?
Well, there's not very many American soldiers involved yet. It's not a reaction to 9/11, which was a deeply traumatic national event. So I think many reasons. I mean, there's been there's been some casualties, but there isn't a sense of our boys going there. Mm-hmm. So I mean, the reasons are many. I think the main thing it's done is split the MAGA coalition. I mean, we always talk about MAGA as a thing, as if they're one block, which is a big mistake, by the way. Mm-hmm. If you ever want to do any kind of counter-propaganda, you have to be able to split the other side. And so again, I've been looking at focus groups with Americans over the last few years, largely interested more about how they feel about Ukraine. But what was one of the most fascinating things for me, going over these in-depth interviews and focus groups, and this is like before Trump came in the Biden era, when my colleagues would talk to self-described MAGA voters, they would constantly talk about those that you cannot name, that country which is sucking us dry and that secretly controls things. So I was really worried they were talking about Ukraine. I'm like, really, you think Ukraine has a sort of influence? Because they're talking about foreign policy. And then it was clear that they didn't actually Ukraine wasn't even in their consciousness. And they were talking about Israel. Now, whatever you may think of, contemporary Israeli politics and Israeli complicity in war crimes, the way they were thinking about Israel had nothing to do with that. It was sort of classic anti-Semitic conspiratorial thinking that they are secretly controlling our society and the Jews are sucking us dry. They'd never say that. They'd always say the people you cannot name. And so it was clear that there was this festering boil of anti-Semitism in the MAGA coalition, while another part of it was super pro-Israel. And it's been fascinating to see that sort of surface. And I don't know, it does remind me a little bit of sort of the main hero of my last book, it's a history book, and he used Nazi propaganda against it. And it's kind of what we're seeing with MAGA. The narratives that have ended up exploding it have been reversing their own language at them. Yeah, so conspiracies about, in this case, Jews, the pedophile scandal with Epstein and the idea of a deep state. So all the stuff that they would push out has turned out to be their largest vulnerability. So we saw the same thing with the Nazis. The most successful counter-propaganda against the Nazis actually came from the right of the Nazis. So my hero would attack the Nazis with voices that were even more radical than them. And we see the same thing in Russia. The most effective counter-propaganda against the Kremlin has been Prigozhin, Girkin, all these people attacking Putin from the right, which is a horrible truth to swallow. So we would like to think that we would preach democratic values to MAGA voters, that we would, tell the Nazis about, how evil fascism is, that we would persuade Russians to believe in democracy. It doesn't work like that. When you're talking about people who are, let's use the term collective narcissism, who are sort of embedded in this sort of toxic psychology, like it or not, the most effective narratives is taking their own evil and using it against them, which is a very uncomfortable place to be morally, but kind of delicious operationally.
It definitely sounds more exciting because I feel like a lot of people are very bored with the terms of like media literacy, let's educate people on knowing how to fact check and other stuff. Like that's objectively sounds way more boring than the idea of that you have to sort of crack the code of knowing how to talk to them in their own language.
Well, actually, I think media literacy, as long as you don't use the term media literacy, can be amazingly exciting. I think part of the problem is the term. Mm-hmm. I'm working on a new book, which is looking at like effective ways to counter toxic propaganda, or authoritarian propaganda. And I think if we think about it as media literacy, that's very boring already. If we think about it as freedom, then it's actually very, very powerful. The stories that I've been covering, a lot of them in Ukraine, they're not about sort of being kind of like, wonkish. They're about like, how can you keep your sense of self in a world where everybody is trying to manipulate you and technology is designed to make each one of us addicted? How can you be free? And the question that the best media literacy practitioners look at, how can you be free? How can you be yourself? How do you know that your thoughts are your own, and most importantly, that your feelings are your own? So that's an incredible, almost spiritual endeavor. So let's not call it media literacy. Let's call it what it really is, which is the almost impossible striving for freedom in a world of mass manipulation. When you put it that way, it's kind of cool.
Yeah, it makes me think why, when you said spiritual, why all of these kind of like spiritual gurus in Ukraine and also abroad are getting a lot of traction, and all of these startups that allow you to like.
Did I use the word spiritual?
Yeah.
I never use that word. See what you've done to me. I would never use. That's so cheesy. That's so bad. I mean, I'm like, almost like, if I have one ideology, is like, I don't trust self-help books. I think they should be thrown with great force against the wall. I agree
with you.
I mean, if anything is snake oil, if anything is propaganda, it's self-help. Like, read this book and you will get rich, feel better, seduce the right husband. Such crass propaganda. It really is terrible. So I hope I didn't use the word spiritual. I probably meant something. You know why I used that word? Because I was actually thinking of St. Augustine's Confessions and like spiritual journeys and that kind of thing, because those are genuine strivings for freedom,
discovery. Yeah.
But also like exactly. So, the whole kind of like, there's actually very, very good self-help books, which they genuinely help you. I mean, they're just very good psychology books. All the bell hook stuff and all those books are great. But the kind of like get rich in 5 minutes stuff, or find your inner zen.
Wake up at 5 a.m. Yeah.
Oh, I wake up at 4 or 5 would be great. Find your inner lotus in 10 minutes. Like,
yeah, I mean, if we go back a little bit to Trump and co, I think it's quite interesting that we see this split among his most loyal sort of like propagandists that helped him to get where he is right now. Again, Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan, Candace Owens, like all of those kind of like big mic figures. They all started sort of having these kind of anti-Trump narratives now. Some of them, I don't know, even say that like, oh yeah, like this is not what I supported. Some of them are less self-reflective in that sense. And he lashed out at them. I was really surprised to see that he would like publicly attack them and go after, because wouldn't he want to sort of still somehow keep them loyal?
So one of the most interesting things about collective narcissism is that it's quite self-destructive, because you're so addicted to feeling superior to others. In that moment when you should collaborate for the greater good, you self-sabotage because the most important thing is being number one. And Trump is, collective narcissism is connected to personal narcissism. It's not the same thing. It's not that like everyone who becomes an adept of collective narcissism is a personal narcissist. That's a much more rare condition. But in Trump's case, he is clearly a malignant narcissist. I mean, I don't think that's hard to ascertain. It self-sabotages because the idea that you would listen to somebody, adapt, collaborate, build a coalition, the stuff of that kind of politics just does not work for that kind of personality and that kind of psychology. So they do self-sabotage.
But yet it seems like they manage to keep that coherence somehow.
They do. So the power of MAGA was that it was not about ideology. It was about uniting any resentment out there. It was sort of an emotion-structured blob, dare I say. That's why it was so powerful. That's why it kept on bringing in new voters. I mean, I've lived in the US for 4 years. I mean, to be honest, I spent half my time here. So I'm more like an observer rather than a participant in America's strange period. But, you would hear pollsters from the Democratic side constantly talking about Trump has reached his ceiling. There's no way he'll get women, people of color, minorities. And yet he does, because it's all about a feeling of, resentment, feeling that you want to humiliate others. It's this very toxic feeling that can be in anyone. Mm-hmm. And so he brings together demographically this quite peculiar coalition.
Like Latinos for Trump, those things.
Exactly. I mean, again, and then you dig into that. Part of that is people from former communist countries who you just say socialist to, and they're like, kill them. So there's a bit of that, but there's also a bit of like, he appeals to a certain strain of feeling inferior in a new country. And that overrides, his racism and stuff like that. That overrides it because just having that feeling satisfied is so strong. But also, look, let's be careful. There's clearly trouble in the MAGA coalition. There's clearly bits that they're kind of crumbling off them, like a brick that's starting to suddenly crumble. But everybody hates the Democrats. There's no upswing for Democrats. So that coalition can reform and actually adapt because it is based on a feeling. Can it do it without Trump? Maybe not. They've lost some people. Will they get them back? Don't know. Will they get some new people? So I would be very careful writing them off because it's like Terminator 2. It can completely reform when an election comes. And we see zero indication that the Democrats have a plan.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately. There's an ongoing conversation here as well about Trump's rhetoric and J.D. Vance's rhetoric about Ukraine that, a lot of the points that they say, they just repeat Russian propaganda straight up, like, level one, not even like some complicated type of witty stories and narratives, but very basic ones, Donbass or Crimea are Russian because people speak Russian there and so on. But it's interesting whether they're consciously amplifying the narratives of Russian propaganda or them and MAGA, Trump, Vance, they are sort of a byproduct of Russian propaganda and everything it was trying to do in America and sort of democratic West. Or can they be both sort of at the same time?
Look, propaganda is always a two-way street. I don't like terms like brainwashing because that sort of envisages a passive recipient of propaganda. And it's not like that. It's always a two-way street. It's always like a desire, supply and a demand side that come together. And the skillful propagandist will understand the emotional and cognitive needs of their audience. But I think what we're talking about, they have their own reasons, which may be to do with geopolitics, domestic politics, financial politics. Let's be frank. Russia is throwing a lot of incentives their way. So they have an appetite for what Russia is feeding them. But I do think something very important is going on, which is that as the front lines in the war become more and more hard to break through, because of the technological innovations, because it's so hard to get through a front line which is swarmed by drones. The perception of what's happening in the war becomes even more important. It was always important. This war was always, a very kinetic war, a very old school war, and a completely postmodern war in the realms of perception. But now it's becoming even more about the realms of perception, influencing what the American administration thinks, influencing the politics in Europe, influencing unity inside Ukraine, which the Russians are doing very actively. And then finally, the next frontier is undermining Russian mobilization and economy, which will actually entail, if you want to do it effectively, some sort of cognitive pressure on them. So it's strange, as the front lines jam, as the kind of the horizontal of the war on the ground becomes a little bit slower, the vertical that goes up into the information space becomes even more important. And we're in this very interesting moment where you see that reflected in so many ways. It's become also a story about who's got the better innovation. There is this kind of Cold War style innovation race going on now, with Ukraine clearly winning this week. We know how quickly this changes. But at the moment, Ukraine is in an amazing moment, which is completely changing the perception of Ukraine. Again, getting partners to go, oh, we should be with this new superpower, which is, revealed this, what we always knew, that this is a country actually of, historically very strong engineering. This is not like, this is where the Soviet weapons were made. I mean, it's not, if you know Ukraine, this is
the
like...
space program.
I know, it's like here. So if you know Ukraine, this is like, duh. But for the rest of the world, it's kind of a complete brain change. Mm-hmm. But that's like a Cold War narrative, that's something that you usually do kind of almost in peacetime, like look at our brilliant engineers and what they're doing. So that's kind of a narrative war happening inside the space of perception. And Zelensky is obviously taking full use of that, and having Fyodorov as your Minister of Defense, as perception becomes important, is, incredibly good fortune, because he's sort of a genius at communication. So something very interesting is going on in the war. And I think now whoever gets better at winning these wars of perception in every battlefield is going to get a very important upper hand.
You mentioned something about the interference in, European elections, and it's kind of interesting to see how Russia has always been there for decades now. I mean, we've seen the examples, but the US sort of became more obvious in how much it wants to sort of like swing some elections, some important elections. In Europe, we saw J.D. Vance in Hungary. The other week didn't really help, but we saw Elon Musk supporting AfD in Germany, and some other examples. I wonder, for the EU, when it comes to that perception as well, are they really aware that they sort of have to sort of now fight on two fronts on informational sphere? Maybe there's more, maybe there's we don't know about Chinese interference as much maybe as we hear about like Russian. And does it really change their perception of like who they are in this information sort of jam that is created around the democratic states and institutions that are still sort of like preserved in Europe, maybe seem weaker? Their alternatives seem weaker in America.
That's such a good question. I wonder where to start from. So for Germany and France, taking what we've been talking about, well, at least since 2014, but really since 2004, seriously, taking political warfare, information warfare, cognitive warfare seriously, because we saw how much it affects, events in Eastern Europe, it was never taken very seriously in Western European countries. It all changed with America turning on Europe, with Musk's interventions, and now what is now an open plan to influence European politics by supporting the Bruderschaft of far-right parties. So has everybody woken up? I don't think so. Policymakers have. And it's a really difficult and treacherous road to traverse, because the Americans have got really sharp arguments around freedom of speech. I don't know if you've been paying attention, but they have essentially accused anyone who works on disinformation, media literacy, all these issues of being part of a censorship industrial complex. European organizations and British organizations that monitor disinformation have now been sanctioned by the US. So they're flipping that argument. They've done it very effectively in America. They're trying to do it in Europe. They're trying to say any attempts to research this space, let alone regulate it, are actually an attack on freedom of speech. And unless European academics, public voices, politicians hurry up and get their arguments clear, and the main argument, of course, is that it's the Americans who are imposing censorship. They're the censors. They own tech companies that suppress some voices and raise others. They're the biggest censors in the democratic world. And until we start making that argument, that we embrace technology, we love their companies, but they have to be transparent. They have to be genuinely in line with freedom of speech, which means revealing how their technology works, how they're changing discourse. That's part of freedom of speech, to receive information. Unless we can make that argument, we're going to have these very clumsy sort of actions like we saw in Germany, where they tried to they did try to censor speech on the internet, which was actually very clumsy and wrong. So I do worry that the European response to the challenge is going to be the wrong one, because there's actually a way of crafting the response which would, I think, be a winning one. Did I answer your question?
Yes, but now I'm curious, what would be the winning one?
You've got to flip the argument. You've got to say, we want more freedom of speech. Freedom of speech means transparent tech companies, that sort of a certain amount of algorithmic transparency. But let's put it different. Maybe I'm using technical language. I, as a citizen, should know whose voice is being elevated on a tech platform and whose is being pushed down and why. I, as a citizen, should understand which of my data is being used to influence me. I should understand when I open a tech platform why I'm seeing one thing and not another. At the moment, the whole thing is manipulated and I'm being manipulated in ways I do not understand. That's fundamentally against the right to receive information. It's kind of like in the spirit of freedom of speech. So we just flip it around. We say, yes, we're pro-tech, but it has to be a tech that's open and transparent, and the public has an understanding of how it works. So at the moment, it's all closed. It's a black box. We don't know, for example, what happened really on TikTok during the Romanian election.
Yeah,
we should have that transparency. We don't know if the AfD rose on X organically. Was Musk helping it? We don't know. We can't live in that kind of murk if we want to live in a democracy.
But the question is there actually any policy leverage that could help us know?
Yeah, they do, of course. I mean, the EU, that's the one thing they do. They have regulatory leverage. That's the one thing they have. But they have to, a policy still won't be practiced unless it's won a public argument. You can have a policy and it just sits there and it's not really acted upon. So the EU do have an apparatus to regulate the tech space, but to really embrace it, you've got to win a public argument. You've got to get the public behind it. And at the moment, they're not doing a very good job.
I always was curious when J.D. Vance, for example, would come to Europe and say that Europe doesn't have freedom of speech. I was wondering who's actually the audience for this message, because to me, and obviously I also have a different perception probably than some other groups, I would think that most Europeans would hear this and laugh about it. And I was wondering whether he's making that message while being in Europe, but actually for the MAGA and American audience back home to sort of install this fear of they don't have freedom of speech, but we still fight and we do have that freedom of speech.
So that's very well noted. So it's for two audiences. One is to support the right wing in Europe who do make that argument and make it very, very loudly. So Farage makes it, AfD make it. So no, there is definitely a constituency that they're supporting because they say there's no freedom of speech because right wing movements are being censored. Yeah. And that message is successful and those parties are growing. So it's not a fringe argument. You're quite right, though. It's also for the audience back home. And it's a way of uniting to another crack in the MAGA coalition, which is the kind of, the tech libertarian authoritarians and the right wing. I mean, Bannon and Musk. We see Bannon and Musk fighting all the time. And one way to unite them is around this question of these claims that Europe is censoring Americans, and censoring the far right. Because that's both, the tech companies don't want regulation, and the far right like to make the argument they're being censored in order to feed a feeling of victimhood. So yeah, you're quite right. He's trying to unite two warring factions.
Mm-hmm. Everyone that's, in at least the European candidates in the elections that we have been very actively supported by, Americans or, got a visit from JD Vance seem to not perform really well. And there is like a running joke question inside Ukraine whether America is actually doing some sort of covert operation where it's like, helping Europe to unite from within by sort of like attacking it from outside, but actually they're, elevating the more democratic candidates, because then we see, what happened in Hungary recently. Obviously, that's kind of like, I guess, like a humorous approach, but I don't know if they actually realize that what they're doing is maybe not being the best strategy. At least maybe they would like have a think after the Hungarian elections, where this firm visit by JD Vance didn't really fruit into anything.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, Hungary was so important to them. I assume that their aim was just to get Orban to stop Tisha from getting an outright majority. I mean, there's no chance that Orban would win. I guess Orban called in a lot of favors. I don't know if it was their idea. I mean, he just may have asked. They felt obligated to do it for many reasons. So, they have failures. They're kind of becoming toxic for some far right parties, but I'm always very worried when we start to get overconfident. I'm worried here that we're all celebrating that we got through the winter and that we're winning the drone war a little bit. I think it's great that people should feel happy.
For a second, at least.
No, I'm not against that. And especially Ukrainians should feel that their innovation and business now is being celebrated. That's great. But I just got back from the East and it's very sobering. What happened in Kherson is happening in Kramatorsk. And people fear it'll happen in Kharkiv. And the Russians will just create kill zones and kill zones and kill zones. And I'm sure we'll have innovations to try to stop that, but you sober up pretty quickly when you leave Kiev.
I mean, you also see what's happening now with the train rides, that for 4 years we've had almost like on the most of the territory of Ukraine, it was an uninterrupted journey that you could take during the night, and now it's not really a case anymore because Russian
but I'm from England, so like if a train's 2 hours delayed, I'm like, and that's not a delay.
Yeah, but like if the Shahed hits the train, that's a little bit different than in England, I guess.
Fair enough.
Something that also J.D. Vance said was very interesting, and I want to go back to your point about Ukraine. He, in his speech in Hungary, he said that, Ukraine has tried to interfere into our elections in the US. Ukraine has tried to interfere in Hungarian elections, and he named something else. This is just what they do. And it sounds so like funny. It's like, wow, Ukraine is such a like superpower now that it can just go into these information spheres and have such an influence. At least that's what they tell themselves and believe. But it actually makes me question if like, what are Ukraine's capabilities right now around kind of, I guess, like working with these cognitive information battles now that we have this experience with Russia. And I don't know how like actually institutionalized that experience is at this point for us to actually be able to have whatever influence abroad.
So my firm belief is that Ukraine can do and is already doing in the cognitive war domain what it's done in the with drones and with different types of military technology. And as is so often in Ukraine, I think people underestimate how remarkable the achievements are. So let's take the sort of domestic stuff first. So look, we just saw Shaheds hitting Dubai. And Ukraine was very quick to respond and, exporting its military technology and know-how to stop the Shaheeds with interceptors. But what people talked about less was the sort of disinformation attacks that came with the Iranian Shahed attacks. So we're also used to it here, kind of, spreading panic, AI videos confusing people, seeding fears, augmenting the power of the strikes. In over 4 years in Ukraine, you've had an ecology develop that counters that. From the kind of maps of attacks that have given people a good sense of where they're coming, which is a way of kind of talking to the population, through to non-stop educational videos for the population, how to behave during attacks, keeping people calm. And then this kind of remarkable group of tech companies, Let's Data, Osavul, others, who are monitoring, anticipating, counteracting the Russian disinformation narratives. And then what is really rare, working with bits of government to preempt these issues. So you've got several strategic communication, counter-disinformation centers in government that work really well with civil society. Now, I know Ukrainians are always telling me how bad our cognitive defenses are. Russian propaganda is everywhere. But actually, the Russian propaganda assault is huge, and we actually deal with quite a lot of it. And I thought there was a real moment there to, when dealing with the Gulf states, to say, guys, here's how we deal with the drones, with our interceptors. And here's our really very unique arrangement of dealing with the disinformation that comes with the attacks. Because what Dubai did, they started arresting Western influencers. I mean, the worst thing you can do, the people you really should get on side, they started arresting them and grabbing them because they'd posted a bit of AI slop. Bad approach. You've got to, and we've learned this the hard way. We've learned that censorship, you can try, and it's, I think, totally fine to do censorship from a foreign government when they're invading you, but they'll still get through, So we've learned in Ukraine that you've got to create a community. It's this all of society cliche actually happens here, for many reasons. And that's a unique ecology. So that's the defensive side. Still, Ukraine is the only country I've worked in where I've worked with journalists at the Public Interest Journalism Lab to create journalism en masse, that reaches parts of the population that might be vulnerable to Russian propaganda. And not just disinformation, but the cognitive side, the really deep issues that they try to tap into. So again, I think you have a generation of journalists here who've adapted to the new world in a way that Western journalists generally haven't, or are only starting to. So I think Ukraine is way ahead on a true all of society approach. I mean, the joke here is always that Ukraine, I remember, hearing this from some of the people who created Rhetoric, which is this incredible AI tool that has transformed what we understand on the front lines. It's kind of an AI analysis tool of everything that's going on in the front that feeds back to general staff to know, for kind of a transparent and accurate understanding of what's going on. I remember talking to some guys who work with them, and they kind of created it because, they thought that's what NATO doctrine wrote. And it turned out that they created what NATO dreamed of doing. And they just created it.
For less money and less time, probably.
Certainly. And it's the same with cognitive defense. You have all these all of society approaches to cognitive defense in various Western kind of doctrines. Ukraine is doing it. Mm-hmm. So I think we're already way ahead. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about communication with foreign audiences, let's ignore Vance. I mean, the fact that he's bigging up Ukraine this way is, I suppose, a compliment. But that's not what it's about. When we're talking about sort of talking with partners, you actually do have to be very careful in not giving anybody a sense that you're intervening in their domestic politics. That is very important. I think it's fine if you're giving information. Yeah, I think if you're dealing in truth and you have that truth, I think you have a duty to release it. Mm-hmm. And I have no idea who released the leaks of Orban and Putin's team talking. I actually don't care because they're genuine and we deserve to know about them. It really doesn't matter to me who it was. And I think people appreciate that, by the way. I don't think they care where they came from, as long as they're real. But, I mean, there's a public interest. But overall, you've got to be very transparent when you have those conversations with another public. And I think Ukraine has managed that amazingly. I think just think back to the start of the war when you had, these incredibly funny, brilliant videos from like the Ukrainian people to the French people, incredibly witty, made by civil society groups, sort of thanking them for their help. They were transformative. I mean, that's not how public diplomacy is usually done. So you had all of society, again, talking to another all of society in a way that wasn't manipulative. It was very, very open, very welcoming into a partnership, and in a completely new idiom and a completely new genre. So I think Ukraine is way ahead on that kind of public diplomacy, talking to another public. It's not just Ukraine that's innovating. Moldova is kind of a bit of a hero in this sense, the way they managed to get the Russians out of their election through really well thought through investigations, communicating with vulnerable audiences, law enforcement coming down on sort of corruption. I thought that was an incredible example as well. But most importantly, Ukraine is where new technologies are being experimented with for cutting edge communication. So, since the start of the war, there's been this, remarkable Ukrainian project to get Russian soldiers to desert. Yeah. And now that's been supplemented with automated bots. Yeah. So you have technology that's being used to stop a genocidal war. So Russia is using technology and innovation, often quite effectively, sadly, to fuel propaganda for a genocidal war, while Ukraine is using technology to undermine that. Yeah? So a different kind of technology race. I could go on and on. I mean, I think every time I meet a group here working in communications, they're doing something amazingly innovative. I met the cultural forces recently who, they do something quite classic. They're artists, musicians who essentially supports the mood on the front. Yeah. Which is classic. You'd always get like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Pop stars to sing for the troops. Sounds easy. But then I got to understand the sophistication with which they use tech and sociology to understand the fluctuations of what's happening on the front, sort of brigade by brigade. And that's what happens when you bring in brilliant marketing guys and brilliant academic sociologists into the army. They're going to bring the most innovative thinking into understanding audiences, into understanding people. They're going to come up with the most innovative technology, and they're going to adapt and implement it very fast because there's a war on. And if your troops are demoralized, it's a little bit more important than, failing in a Coca-Cola ad. Yeah? And the stakes are so much higher. But it was remarkable. I've never seen anything that sophisticated. I think American partners looked at it and were stunned as well. I mean, everybody looks at the morale of the troops, but this was broken down by, a really deep understanding of identity, loyalty, and confidence that was really quite stunning. And I think that's happening everywhere. I think people, like always in Ukraine, all have discrete challenges in innovating, including, by the way, to undermine mobilization inside Russia. The research that I see on that is superb. But it's all happening all over the place. No one's thinking about it strategically. Even within government, I think there's, I know of at least 7 agencies thinking about these things in different ways.
Why do you think is that?
Well, that's just the way Ukraine's pluralistic. It's a genuinely pluralistic society. Same as the drones thing happened pluralistically. It's great that it's not centralized, but at the moment, there is a moment when you have to keep that pluralism, but go, okay, but we have a common aim. This is the strategic aim, so that you can focus all the efforts in a certain direction. And as the war becomes more and more about perception, on all fronts, inside Russia, inside Ukraine, to partners internationally, what I would love to see is Ukraine and its partners take these wonderful cognitive innovations, these innovations in communication, these tech innovations in communication, and start to really push them together for a common aim. And I think I actually don't think we have a choice, because the war is going to be more and more about the space, and we have to compete. So I think it'll happen. It's just a question of will it happen efficiently or not.
It's interesting with the sort of all society approach that you highlighted in your answer here, because that makes me sort of like question whether Ukraine's experience, this experience throughout this war in very different realms of life, from just kind of like daily life under the, blackouts and no heat and electricity, to this pluralism of drone and technical warfare, to sort of this kind of resistance on the informational side. Can it really be exported? Because I feel like there is a lot of things that you're talking here are about culture, about how Ukraine is very sort of, decentralized. And if, we look at the UAE, it's clear that the UAE government, they first wanted the drones, and I mean, UAE or the Gulf, and then they realized that the drones are not enough. You need sort of like the whole ecosystem around the drones. And then there's what you're talking is another dimension of that ecosystem, is also understanding the cognitive warfare that comes with it. But the Gulf states, for example, they're very sort of top down. Like there is monarchy, you just rely on the sheikhs, they need to protect us. It was very interesting to see how they responded on the government level to the attacks, and how the sheikh went down and walked Dubai Mall and showed that he's like with the people. It was very kind of, I don't know, authoritarian-esque in a lot of senses. So I wonder if, when we talk about Ukraine sort of sharing this experience, if it's actually possible to fully apply it to other countries and contexts, or is there something that is sort of just doesn't really click because there is a deep difference in culture? We can also talk about Europe and, the culture of sort of like feeling secure and safe, and the war is not going to happen with us.
I mean, that's a fascinating question about like, how things move and how they adapt, and I'm sure there'll be lots of theories about that. I'm not a huge expert on Dubai. I've been there a few times. I mean, if one country in that region or one city-state in that region is good at taking elements of democracies and building it and kind of like grafting it onto their system, it's them. I mean, from the legal system they adopted from England, I mean, they tend to be quite good at, this kind of odd combinations of systems around effectiveness. So let's not be too full of cliches about different models. So, but you're right. No, of course that's part of it. And it doesn't, these things won't be linear, but even at the level of inspiration, I don't think Ukrainians realize how good they are. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ukrainians do put themselves down quite a lot. Actually, it's like,
Well, it's interesting to see this kind of like perception of somebody a little bit from outside. I know you spend a lot of time here, so I don't want to say that you're fully from outside, but yeah, like I think we do talk about like how we can be better, and this is where we've done not so good and not a perfect job. So we need to sort of improve in the future, because I think that's the only way to sort of race in this battle that we're in.
I just think what's going on here is absolutely remarkable. And I don't know that we talked about Rhetoric, that the whole world hasn't actually heard of it, is partly because, we can do more to talk about it, but also because of cliches and stereotypes in the West. I mean, the idea that Ukraine is some sort of backwater of Eastern Europe is still there. So it's a two-way thing. It's not just Ukraine not telling its story, it's people not always ready to listen.
Well, Europe has a lot of sort of like think tanks, also private initiatives, and researchers who work with disinformation, understanding how it works, countering sort of like propaganda and so on. And there's definitely some exchange with the Ukrainian counterparts. But I wonder if there's also some sort of case like we saw that happened with NATO joint exercises with the Ukrainian army, when NATO realized, like we're really screwed here, because Ukraine started using all of these kind of things on the battlefield that NATO hasn't really even heard of. Like they couldn't identify where the drone is flying at them, and they would be killed in like, reality situation. So that kind of made Ukrainians look at ourselves and say like, we're actually now it's not NATO who's teaching us and training our soldiers, but it seems like they need help with that. So is there the same thing that's happening on sort of like disinformation cognitive field?
So not yet. I think people who look at it like, kind of professionally the way I do, we see it. And we see the questions that Ukrainians are asking are sort of incredibly sophisticated and deep. And I think, for example, with the kind of ecology that defends against disinformation, I think there is at least some cognizance of that. There was a good paper by Halina Padalko of Harvard on this issue, but that's kind of one of the first ones I've seen. So I think there's still a little bit of a way to go. But I was at a kind of a Stratcom's trade fair conference recently in DC, with countries that do different kind of with companies that do different kinds of Stratcom's activities, cognitive warfare, countering disinformation, the whole gamut from defense to psyops. And it was interesting. So the vast majority of the companies were American, a few British, and the rest Ukrainian, not one European. Yeah. So in the sense of which countries are going to lead on this in Europe, it's going to be British and Ukrainian ones. They're the only ones who are thinking about this actively. Some countries are. I mean, the Estonians certainly are, but I don't know if they really have an industry around it yet.
Why do you think it's the case?
Well, because for Ukraine, it's existential. So we've been reacting. The Brits have always thought they're good at, propaganda, counter-propaganda, while the Europeans, for many reasons, have shied away from it. We can think of many reasons, but the reality is that. In terms of technology, no, the Americans are still ahead in the sense that they plow a lot of resource and research and money into this. So the way the Russians have many institutions that think about propaganda, research, how it affects the brain, how it affects society. I mean, they have quite a developed sort of research body behind their propaganda, which no one in Europe does. The Americans have a little bit. So there's several universities that have, sort of top secret cognitive warfare departments that will be doing things like building up simulations of countries in South Asia and gaming out how different types of information operation or influence will play out in, I don't know, the obvious, Taiwan or the Philippines. Trying to game out, how will they react to a Chinese attack or something? So essentially creating a digital twin of the information space. So you have like a digital twin of not just audiences, which is what marketing companies do, but societies. That's the way they're thinking. That's kind of where the most sophisticated thinking is. I don't think we have something like that for Russia yet. I think we should build one. I think it would be very, very important for Western partners to start understanding the enemy with the kind of detail that they probably understand us. So we're all, I think, a little bit behind at the moment in that kind of level of understanding and sophistication. But for the Americans, it's all sort of theoretical. They're in theory creating, I don't know, simulation, info war games of stuff. While, with Ukraine, we're testing it all in reality. Whether it's how do we defend our society better? How do we do things to the Russian that mess up their war machine? We can actually try things. And that puts Ukraine at a huge advantage. So if I'm thinking about the next generation of cognitive warfare, Ukraine is in a position to actually pilot the reality rather than just simulating the theory, which is largely what's done in America.
In one of your recent interviews, you said that it's really difficult for democratic countries to work in that counter sphere, to actually go into those spaces and to do counter influence, because then, unless you're in a war, unless you're declared that you're in a war, that might seem like contradictory to some ethics, morality standards, democratical values that these countries kind of like preach. And I'm paraphrasing here, obviously. But I wonder what it would take, unless it's just, just declaring the war, and it is, for Europeans actually to start thinking that we have to fully work in their space and not just sort of like fund and, try to find these disinformation streams in our informational space. Is this about kind of like also perception? Is it political will? Is it, I don't know, money and innovation for them as well?
No, it's all political will. The moment you get a green light, the market appears instantly. It's not as if Britain and Europe aren't full of propagandists who would love to start being much more active in this space. No, it's all about political will, and I feel that's changing. So I'm not an expert on doctrine, but new NATO doctrine talks about deterrence in the cognitive space. There's only, that means doing something to the enemy. Mm-hmm. Also, I just think politically, because doctrine is whatever. Politically, look, there's an understanding that the old theory of change, that Putin will just stop one day, that's not on the cards. So you need to find all the points of leverage. Economic, kinetic, cognitive is one of many that you would think about. But most importantly, Putin wants to create an army of 1.5 million. That's not just about Ukraine. So therefore, we will have a common interest at the very least to undermine that process of mobilization. And one of the tools you have for that is various types of cognitive operations. I mean, that's just something that we will agree on. That is something we will want to stop. There's many ways to undermine that, but that's the really obvious one. So I just think there's just some obvious things now that they're a problem for everybody. They're a problem for Germany as much as they are for Ukraine. So we have common interests. Also, Russia is just getting very, very aggressive inside of Europe with assassinations, sabotage, cyber attacks. It's becoming it's going up and up and up. That gets different reactions. Some people get very intimidated. Some countries get very intimidated and get very scared, which is what Russia wants. While others feel a lot more emboldened to act. So I think, the more aggressive Russia becomes, the more there's an understanding that it's fair game to do something back at them.
In your recent book, you show how propaganda is not, or fighting propaganda is not just about, providing truth and versus the lies and sort of juxtaposing them for the audience, but it's actually working a lot with their identity, with their sense of belonging and other kind of more emotional feelings. And when we talk about Russia and having to sort of counter Russian influence and work in their space and work with their perceptions, I wonder if we even understand what is Russian identity currently. What does it mean in sort of practical and not only just practical terms today?
Well, let's start. I mean, because it's very easy to slide off into a fascinating but maybe not YouTube friendly conversation about what is identity and so on. And let's just talk about results. So there's nonstop polling, clever polling, not stupid polling, message testing, and research into how to affect different parts of Russians' behavior and attitudes. So we don't have to theorize. We can see what works. So Open Minds Institute, really good Ukrainian strategic communications and cognitive defense company. They produce really interesting kind of analysis of discourse in Russia, of polling, and also sort of they look at what works in undermining mobilization, for example. And it's very interesting, when they tried showing Russians pictures of Russian soldiers dying, that actually increased support for sending your relatives to fight. Yeah. I think it showed two reasons, yeah? One, there isn't a whole lot of empathy in this society. So going back to the argument about collective narcissism I was making again, which is one that's sort of confirmed by the Kremlin's own polling. Collective narcissism is a feeling when you feel great personally by associating yourself with the kind of supremacist greatness of your culture and your country. But it's just about your feeling. It's not actually about empathy. It's not actually collective. It's not communal. It's just you getting a high from feeling that your country beat somebody else up. And so, this lack of empathy that Russians have had for sort of other soldiers, the lack of kind of caring whether more of them die, which I think was such a shock to Ukrainians and Westerners. Yeah. They're like, wouldn't they like just start rebelling at one point? Like they've lost so many men. She didn't seem to care. That's very evident when you try to sort of do campaigns around your boys are dying. They don't work to reduce support for the war. What did work, and again, quite minimally, to be honest, but it did work a little bit, was stories about increase of crime in Russia as a consequence of the war. So, as we all know, Putin releases prisoners, they go to the front, they come back, they rape and kill. Firstly, that data is censored by the Kremlin. They know this is very sensitive. They push down stories about this as much as they can. And we kind of theorized, why is that actually more effective in undermining people's desire to send their relatives to fight? Yeah, because it's not linear. You know, you've got a war over here, you've got crime over here. But I would speculate that that story undermines the sense of greatness and that we are getting up off our knees much more effectively than our boys are dying. Yeah. So the sense that the 90s are returning, that Putin is bringing chaos, that is much more a kind of an affront to the sense of grandeur that you're meant to have. Yeah. So I'm talking about people's support for the war and their desire to send their relatives. I'm not saying what will put off an individual soldier, yeah, from signing up. That's a slightly different issue. There you probably do show this is your future and stuff like that. Though even there it's much more subtle than that. The things that seem to be much more effective is undermining the idea that you know where you're going to serve. So you think you're going to be a cook, but you're actually going to be this, you know. You're going to be sent to the meat grinder. But that's very different. That's a very different situation when somebody's already on their way to serve. But if you're undermining support more generally, and you're undermining the parents or the relatives' desire to send their relatives to serve, that works. There's been amazing research by Lingva-Lexa, another Ukrainian NGO, that did polling of Russian POWs in Ukraine. And again, it's, you know, I think any results they have, you have to think they're actually much worse. In the sense that people will be slightly modifying their answers to sort of seem less extreme. But basically you found that it's around half and half. Half say they're serving for money, half are serving for some sort of ideas about, you know, make Russia great again. And the ones who are serving for ideas and some of the ones serving for money don't see Ukrainians as fully human. So that stuff is working. You know, this idea that Russia is superior, Ukrainians are subhuman, Russia is almost duty bound to invade. That stuff works. Also, the ones who repeat Russian propaganda are the ones most likely to fight a second time. Yeah, to come back. So look, it's a mix. Some are serving. It's a business deal. Others more for the ideas. Often, by the way, I think it's a very complicated combination of the two. So, you know, the picture that we have of a society is a society that, just from the evidence, yeah, that we have, is a society that is based, for all its cynicism, for all its sort of like, you know, for all the money that is spent on the war, propaganda and a kind of aggressive, supremacist version of imperialism, which is very akin to fascist propaganda and Nazi propaganda, does play a role. And it has these sort of side effects of, you know, both wanting collective grandeur and having very little empathy for your own people, let alone the other people. And that propaganda works because it hits a need, it hits a demand. You know, propaganda is always two ways. You know, so in that sense, this is a social condition. You know? So that's what we can see from the research that Ukrainian groups are doing, from what works and doesn't work in terms of effects. It's a pretty dismal picture.
We actually, at Ukrainer, we're releasing a book soon that's based on sort of like a very similar to this research that you named. It's based on conversations with Russian POWs, but it's more like a set of essays and you know, like more kind of a deeper look into qualitative data and like what they actually say, how they actually justify
really
things, and what they think about more kind of philosophical concepts of freedom and unfreedom, how they actually think about those things.
And what do they think?
I mean, there's a lot of different things that I'm not going to reveal yet, because it's about to come out and we're going to be talking about it more. But there is an interesting sense of how deeply they're comfortable with the sense of unfreedom that they have. It's almost like they do realize it, but they justify it so much that they think that that's an only way to sort of kind of like live in their worldview. They probably try to sort of like tell themselves that unfreedom is actually a way that, it's sort of like better live life. And that was, I mean, at least for me, that was kind of like striking to see. But I don't know if that's just repeating sort of like the propaganda messages, or is it more sort of just a way to justify it to yourself? Yeah.
I mean, that's how propaganda works. It gives you justifications for like that you need for yourself. I mean, it's we really have to think about propaganda as a tool. Effective propaganda is it does give people a script, but it's a script they want to play. It's a role they want to inhabit. It's a role they're comfortable with inhabiting. You can't actually force things on people. Mm-hmm. That's when it fails, I guess that's why the pro-democratic propaganda in Russia failed. But and then you get very interesting feedback loops. So with collective narcissism, for example, when the researchers looked at it, people might not be super narcissistic before, but once they've been exposed to it a lot, they become more narcissistic. So you get into these weird loops, and the propaganda choices a society makes can push it in different directions. So there's a lot of choice there as well. Nothing is totally inevitable. But I mean, these things are always a dialogue.
And I wonder, when we talk about this, like us sort of like having this deeper look inside Russia and studying Russians, we see that in the West, there's still sort of like, I mean, if we just kind of like throw away the researchers and academics and people who like seriously kind of like studying it, when we look at like pop culture or general public, there's still sort of like a romanticism or this idea that, we need to just understand this deep, complicated Russian soul. Can Ukraine actually, with the experience it has, in your opinion, change that kind of narrative as well, or influence how, or inform how the Western general public sees Russia today? Because obviously, I mean, yes, like nobody is like romanticizing the war, but there's still, at least we feel, this belief like, the war needs to stop. Russian culture is great. It's still like a sort of civilization that's very important to the history of Earth. So, we're gonna go and try to understand it. Yeah.
So I think it's so important to think about this, because Russia uses culture and has always used culture as an integral part of its propaganda machine. Maybe it's most successful, by the way, if you think about it. Communism, that collapsed. Their disinformation stuff doesn't always work, by the way, hit and miss. Mm-hmm. Worked really well in some countries, kind of worked against them in others. What they're really good at is using their culture to communicate many things. As you say, the inevitability of Russia. I mean, I think I haven't seen very much research. This has been kind of more on instinct, but I think there's a connection, I think you're right, between the sense of we will inevitably have to do a deal with them and their sense of cultural permanence. I think you're completely right. So they use it very, 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 in a very thought through way, and always have in the 19th century, totally integral to communist propaganda. So for them, culture is totally mixed up in political influence. And I think it is time to have a serious conversation about how we think about the strategic nature of that challenge. Because I think often the reaction is very emotional, which is understandable, but not necessarily that productive. Mm. So I think there's really good things happening. So the first thing is to get Ukrainian voices out there. So the Ukrainian institutes that are appearing, the very slow, I wish it was faster, appearance of Ukrainian literature in bookshops, the great work that Olesya Khromenchuk does at the Ukrainian Institute in London. That's great. It's so important. I mean, the first thing you do is make sure Ukrainian voices appear and are well translated and passionate and stuff like that. So I think that's kind of a given. And it's sad that there wasn't enough of that before. And I'm glad to see that some of that is starting again, not always directed by the States because it's Ukraine. That's step one. But that's kind of quite classic cultural diplomacy. And we're in a war. So I don't think that's enough. I think it's really important. There should be more of it. But the other side is doing this in a much, much more strategic way. They are thinking about it as cultural warfare, in the sense that they have an aim, they have audiences, they connect it to political change. They use culture as they sometimes just use it as a front for spies. So it's completely integrated into their machine. So just thinking about classic cultural diplomacy is a really important move, but that's not the same thing. So if you're thinking about this strategically, you are then thinking about, okay, what are the audiences that we want to get to? Who is being influenced by Russian culture? First, we want to start measuring this at least a little bit, But I think your instinct is right. I think it does go very deep. I think there is actually a connection between, Dostoevsky and we must do a deal with Russia. It works on a very deep level. It's a sort of, you'd want polling might help. I think in-depth interviews, metaphor elicitation, these much more sophisticated ways of thinking about people's attitudes and behaviors are going to be much more important. So you start to think about those audiences. How do you get to those audiences? What are the effective ways of creating a rupture between those things? Do you turn Dostoevsky against Dostoevsky? Do you... I don't know how significant Solzhenitsyn is, but the idea that Solzhenitsyn was some Democrat, which is still pervasive, is just like...
Fighter for freedom?
No, he was, but and then imposer of kind of Tsarist imperialism. So a complicated character, to put it mildly. But even that, so you think about how to do that in a very, very thought-through way. Look, if you're thinking about it strategically, you're thinking about audiences, you're thinking about where you want to move them, and you're thinking what message is going to work. So there's a lot to do there, And in the Cold War, we were actually very good at it. We, as in the collective West, were very good at this. But the theory then, and I think we see actually weirdly an echo of it now, the theory then was very much you split off the good Russians. So you had evil Orthodox Church, we help support the independent Russian Orthodox Church, etc., etc. You had Soviet literature, we support Solzhenitsyn and get Pasternak the Nobel Prize. Get is too strong a word, but encourage Pasternak getting a Nobel Prize. And I guess you see a legacy of that today. Because it kind of worked then, we think it will work today, when actually something very different is needed now. And I think the way to go now, if the tactical level is thinking audience by audience and how you start rupturing that connection between Russia's political weight and its cultural weight, I think if we move forward, I think we should have to be much more bold. And I've been inspired actually to these thoughts by Ukrainian, we would call them in England, I don't know, in Ukrainian strategic communicators. I love the word that's used in Ukrainian myth designers, to think about this. Myth design, what a cool term. I want to be a myth designer. You're a myth designer already.
I think you are as well, maybe.
All my life I've been a myth designer, and I just thought I was writing books. But they kind of encouraged me to think about it, but also talking to people in some of the countries around Ukraine, especially Georgia. Russia hasn't always been the cultural and intellectual and artistic power. I mean, I would say it even wasn't in the Soviet Union because they were suppressing so many other voices and co-opting them and the Russian Empire. So firstly, they were co-opting others. But even looking back further, when it was when it wasn't the vast empire, the cultural dominance was, the history of the Lavra, Mahilyanka, a completely different series of networks. And we can see those networks bubbling through again now. And I think Ukraine is going to be the pivotal country of cultural influence and political influence, not just in the sense of political parties, but political cultural influence, a way of doing things. What does that mean practically? Let's take the Russian Orthodox Church, one of the most malign and effective tools that they have. I mean, completely in bed with the security services, as we know here, and we know from Moldova and bits of Africa, completely enmeshed in kind of kinetic operations and provocations and so on. But at the same time, really hard to kind of do anything about because A, it has a hold over the emotions of people.
Yeah, and then it's religion. You cannot touch religion.
Exactly. So really hard. So to start that conversation, which is a really hard one and can backfire on you, first you need to do the classic journalism stuff. You need to expose the fact that they're actually a front. And you have to do that with a lot of evidence. You've really got to change the argument that they're not actually a church. They're actually a branch of the Russian security services. So you need that bit. But then you have to start working on something much deeper, which is kind of, I guess, a unity of other churches in the region and other Orthodox churches in the region to start showing that they're the ones who are the true Christianity, or the true Orthodoxy. And suddenly the Lavra, which for the viewers who don't know is like this incredibly important religious center in Kiev, which Kremlin, the Moscow Patriarchate has managed to kind of co-opt for a long time and is now changing and start making that almost like a center of orthodoxy in the region. And looking forward, look, America is abandoning its own old role of sort of support for media and free culture in the region, the way they supported Radio Free Europe in the past and the way they supported NGOs and cultural centers, that's all retreating. Who's going to take its place?
Yeah, what's going to fill the gap?
I mean, whatever it is, it's going to be led by Ukraine. So I know no one's focused on this now because we're all thinking of, quite understandably, thinking about the front lines.
But to do that, it feels like you need to have so much economic, possibility, like so much money to actually...
So I think we'll see coalitions. I think it'll be partners with common interests. It's actually not that expensive compared to, making F-16s. I think we'll see it'll be more complicated. I think we'll see partnerships involved. But let's say the war pauses. Russia goes full out on the information political warfare front. They'll push through the Caucasus. Yeah, they'll start pressuring Moldova much more than they are now. They'll try to encircle Ukraine. That means us, together with organizations there, together with partners, are going to have to push back against that. This is not like a romantic idea of like rebirthing, Kievan Rus or something, or Rzeczpospolita, or I'm not talking about this as a romantic thing. I'm just talking about this as like hard politics. The Americans won't do it. Yeah. So it'll be a coalition of the countries who care about this, with Ukraine as its kind of beating heart because it's most existential here. So yeah, the Radio Free Europes of the future will probably be Polish-Ukrainian collaborations, if we can keep that collaboration going. It's challenging. But we can, I think, because I think there's common interests. So I think we have to think big. Not because of any kind of search for grandeur, but because Russia will keep on pushing through these other means. And the Americans won't do their bit. And it's up to Ukraine and the other few countries who take this seriously to lead. So yeah, the future, what was Radio Free Europe and will be, I hope, for another few years, but we're talking about a decade from now, 2 decades from now, will have its heartbeat from Ukraine. And the Georgian opposition will, or maybe not opposition by then, will be in Kiev even more than they were before. And I think we already see that. You see sort of like, institutions in Ukraine talking to independence movements within Russia. I think Ukraine realizes this. So apart from being a drone superpower, apart from being a cognitive leading power, I think Ukraine, again, as it was centuries ago, will be the place from which cultural power is organized and exported. And it's happened before, so why wouldn't it happen again?
We see that there's still a sense that Russian opposition is going to sort of save Russia, and the West still wants to sort of make some alliances. We see them come to European Parliament and so on. And it is a concern inside Ukraine of what are we going to do with them, since they have sort of ability to capitalize on the Western attention when it comes to these questions of Russia's future. And instead of listening to probably Ukraine and some other actors, they could sort of get all of the resources and attention. So I don't know, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, like what do we do with the Russians, or how maybe there's a different angle here, like what actually can emerge from Russia to actually be that opposition that can bring change. Like if we talk about, the coalitions of all of the ethnic groups that are, talking about the oppression in Russia and actually saying things about decolonization, deimperialization of Russia, maybe that can become an alternative to whatever is called Russian opposition currently.
So, I mean, I think obviously somebody has to be thinking long term about what happens in the space currently known as Russia. That means thinking very long term about, I guess, sort of education and educating a potential future generation into not thinking like imperialists, which sort of is one of the underlying historical reasons here. And I think quite legitimate complaints about most people who call themselves liberals in Russia is that they don't seem to have surrendered their instincts for being an empire. I mean, I remember Chubais when he wrote a very famous kind of set of articles, early 2000s, about Russia being a liberal empire. The idea was it wouldn't need to invade other countries like Ukraine. It would just sort of attract them and dominate them economically. So it was like you can have, fascist empire or you can have liberal empire, but it was always empire. And so I guess like the really long-term plan is to think about, a really long-term education that is somehow engaging like really young Russians into thinking a different way. So that would be a generational plan. And it is somebody's job to think about that. I don't know whose, but that is important, And I thought you probably have to start at that age, almost like school age. I mean, see how difficult it is for French and Brits to not think about themselves as empires. But it takes a lot of work, and you should start now. It's the sort of thing that happened in Germany after the war. So I think it would be advisable to start now and think about those educational projects. But let's be clear, that has nothing to do with ending the war. So my priority is helping in any way I can to win the war of now. And I'm very much of the kind of, this is great survivor of Auschwitz, Frankel, whose works are very popular in Ukraine. And, there is almost sort of a false friend in thinking about, who will be the next government in Russia. I'm like, I don't see any changes coming. They might go through different phases. You'll switch from Putin to Patrushev, but the political DNA is centuries old. So we're dealing with an aggressive Russia in different forms. So we're thinking about, well, it'd be wonderful if it broke apart, but what we're dealing really right now is how do we containment feels a bit 20th century. Sectioning, maybe. That's more a psychiatric term. But So I'm just focused on that. What is the ways of doing that? We're into a century of strategic competition that's not going to end. Ukrainians are quite right when they say that this was always the start of very many wars, which we now see sort of spreading throughout the world. And that's not an emotional analysis, that's an objective analysis, because when the main hegemon retreats, when the old systems fall apart, you get lots of conflicts. That's the world we're heading into. My priority is to make sure that the countries I care about the most, which are Ukraine and Britain, can survive and flourish, and with our friends. And we're having to rethink who our friends are. So I'm just thinking about that. And I think it's kind of, for me, almost been indulgence. It's sort of like something slightly masturbatory about, like, oh, who will be the next president of Russia? I'm like, some motherfucker. And we have so much work to do to remake our militaries, remake our alliances, remake our understanding, not just of defense, which is happening, but of security. Rethink our supply chains, rethink our cultural influence, rethink our whole media environments to balance democracy and a hostile environment, to start thinking strategically, which we can't in democracies because we have different institutions prioritizing different things and no way to plan properly. That's more than enough for me to be getting along with purely as an academic, as a writer, let alone somebody who's, is sometimes involved in different bits of activity. So I think that is a lot of work to do. And I see no serious political, sort of liberal democratic movements in Russia. I don't know enough about the different ethnicities and what's happening there. The kind of analysis we did of Tatarstan at the start of the war didn't show an uptick in demands for secession. It's always there, but it didn't go up. I don't know about others. Obviously, the Caucasus is an explosive powder keg, but you need an expert in the Caucasus who could really talk about that, which I'm not. So look, they're different things. If we're talking about regions in Russia, Tatarstan has one set dynamic. The Caucasus has another. There's lots of economic anger in northwestern Russia because they've lost out from the war. There's a lot of bitterness towards the regions that have done economically well. There's clearly a lot to do there, whether that's about independence or whether about clogging up the system as it is now. It's probably more of the latter at the moment. So yeah, look, we have so much to do. Sadly, we're just at the start of a century of call them what you want, hybrid wars, mix of kinetic and strategic competition. So let's just focus on getting so good that it might prove, let's just make sure that we're better than the other side. That's all I really care about.
Something that we haven't really touched upon, but this is going to be kind of like one of the last questions because I know that we have to wrap. And something that you haven't really talked about, which I'm surprised is AI and this whole AI race as we.
I can talk about that.
Because kind of like the main sort of AI giants right now, they're all in the West, kind of like the American tech. But we know that China is doing their own thing. It doesn't seem like Russia has an alternative. I don't know what they're doing. Maybe
Sberbank have got a LLM.
Okay, yeah. So they're obviously Russia. We can see that Russia is obviously using already LLMs to sort of feed their bots and make the bots more effective. But I wonder what's the role of AI as we look at this cognitive warfare and the future of it. Is it just making it sort of bigger and better at scale, or is it doing something else there?
No, I think it's a really good question. And again, talking about Ukraine as the kind of focus of not just drone warfare, but cognitive warfare, this is the main thing I think that we can learn here. My sense is it's not just a scale thing. My sense is there is something about the idea that they're not just going to scale, but that they can adapt and reinvent, which is game-changing. So you give your AI an instruction, go create me a political movement to win the next election, and it starts changing and adapting, and before you know it, you've created a fascist movement, which you didn't even intend to. That is different. Yeah. So the fact that they would go there, the fact that you create a mass swarm, okay, it does change a lot of things, but it's still this. You still commanded it to do something. The idea that it would then adapt and then do something that was never planned, and that could lead to completely different consequences, I think that's different. I think the idea of personalization to the point where it can start communicating with individuals and changing that conversation is a shift. Again, it's we've always had that, but I don't know, that does feel as if you're going to get unintended consequences that we haven't planned for. So that I think that's the game changer, the idea of unintended consequences that were never there at the start. And that's something to look at. But at the end of the day, well, even there, the propaganda campaign is only as good as the strategy. But if the AI is creating the strategy and then creates more strategies, then again, you're into a weird space. So no, there could be something game-changing. But what happens in most wars is that there is a kind of breakthrough in how we understand propaganda, which is another way of saying there's a breakthrough understanding what we know about human behavior and how you change that behavior. So in the First World War, you have people like Edward Bernays who take part in World War I, and then he creates the field of public relations. So public relations kind of born out of the adventures of American propaganda in World War I. In World War II, well, lots of horrific experiments from the Nazis, which then are replicated and we still reference in terms of ways of connecting propaganda and violence. But also maybe less noticed is these huge steps forward which are made by people like Harold Lasswell in America, who's this academic that works with the American government and is analyzing both how to undermine Nazi propaganda, strengthen American resilience, and invents so much of what we do today, content analysis, looking for emotional patterns in language, kind of going towards thinking about sort of, psychological impact of propaganda in a more structured way. Stuff that we've been replicating in the decades since. That starts happening in World War II. Loads of experiments with behavioral change. How lots of like mass social experiments about when do people change their behavior in certain types of organization. When do they become more authoritarian? When do they become more liberal? All that comes out of World War I and II. So really, kind of everything that we look at in propaganda, marketing, advertising, education on this topic comes out of wars. So we're going to have the same thing now. We're going to go through a rapid learning climb on issues like AI. But also, look, if you're looking at something like Russia, take the little example that I took about the relationship between what messages work to stop people sending their relatives to the front. That's a fascinating question between these big stories, these big myths, and super precise behaviors. And we have more opportunity to start mapping those correlations with different types of digital analysis than we ever have in the past. So something's going to change there. That the main question that propagandists are obsessed with, what is the relationship between attitudinal change and behavioral change? If there's one thing that every propagandist is an advertiser is sort of always breaking their head over, how do you get that relationship going? We'll discover a lot more. On the legal side, things will be changing. Every war creates new legal norms around propaganda. So we've just finished a huge work with, we as in the Reckoning Project, which is a war crimes NGO I co-founded, together with Global Rights Compliance, which is a humanitarian law firm. We've just done, I think, some very innovative work about nailing the responsibility of Russian propagandists by showing how they create what we call information alibis. That's disinformation before an atrocity. So before they bomb somewhere, a civilian object, they'll say the Ukrainians did it. Yeah. And they do this over and over. And we identify the people behind it, the patterns. And our argument is that this is a form of aiding and abetting, and we can track that because of the digital footprint. You couldn't do that before. You can do that in radio. We can do that now. We can say, look, the way they're posting and writing about this shows a coordinated behavior. This is not random. They can't just say, we said something and we didn't know the future. You are doing this in a way that's so systemic that it's connected to it. So again, the digital sphere is changing the legal norms. So that's what we're in the middle of. The communications piece, the analysis piece, the AI piece, the feedback iterative piece. All that is going to play out. And Ukraine is going to be the place where it's pioneered, because this is just, the war of the future. We see that in every piece of technology that's being used here. So very dangerous times. We just have to make sure we win.
Before gifting you one of our books, I wanted to ask a question, mainly for our paid subscribers on our YouTube channel. What are some of your favorite books that have been published in English about Ukraine, this war, maybe the subject of cognitive warfare, apart from yours, that you could recommend and you could really say that they offer an interesting perspective in?
This is to English readers. So to...
Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, it's still too... The translation of Ukrainian works into English is still too slow, but it's getting a lot better. So there are so many books to look at now. My favorite book of the war is... Yermolenko's Życie na Mierze, but that hasn't been translated yet. So I have to like that. Alexander Mikhed has been translated into English. I'm thinking who else has been translated into English. I'm very interested in how art reacts to war. In literature, usually gets into the mode of memoirs and recording. And there's amazing memoirs that are being written already. There's, like Hemingway doesn't know anything about Rhetoric. There's Miched's book. Any play that Natalia Voroshbit writes about the war is just kind of basically a masterpiece. She does documentary theatre. But they're all about documenting direct experiences. They're kind of almost a form of memorialization. I'm really interested in what art is doing. So today in Kiev, there's an opening of one of my favorite conceptual Ukrainian artists, Gavnut. He's got an incredible exhibit, which I think will go around Europe as well, where he keeps like a diary of the war. And I'll say he asked books, but he combines visual and writing. So he's got a picture and then some sort of writing there as well. And I had the privilege of going a day early and being shown around, and I'm still kind of speechless about how good it is. And he's from Kharkiv, and it's a kind of a visual and word diary of the war in Kharkiv, full of wit and humor and depth and a kind of grim optimism. I think it's just a work of genius. So it's called, I think the exhibit is called, what's it called even? We don't even need time. You should look it up and maybe put a thing there. But I hope that goes around Europe. I know his other works have. But that's just what struck me yesterday. And then barely a week goes by without me just being completely blinded with the power and beauty of some new piece of Ukrainian art that's coming out of the war. So I would keep an eye on the visual arts, not just the books. I think the books are doing what books should do, and they're doing it very, very well because there's so many gifted writers here. But it's weird because it's quite easy for writing. We just write about the war. For artists, it's hard. How much figurative art can you do about the war? You can't. It's interesting since some of the artists I see, they start with figurative stuff, like bombed out bridges, and then you see them getting more and more abstract as they're trying to make sense of it. So you have a war happening, which is going on so long that people are already analyzing it. The sort of analysis that would come after. So if a Joseph Beuys in Europe, so he's a very famous abstract artist, starts working after the end of the Second World War, here you've got people already doing abstract art, which is the highest form of making sense of something. You're taking trauma and you're raising it to the level of abstraction. It's the most therapeutic form of art, I find, as the war goes on. Plus, they're serving.
Yes.
I was in an exhibit, an incredible, a really remarkable artist's set of studios, sort of a squat studio place. But squat is the wrong word, but it's a building they use for studios, with absolutely remarkable contemporary art. So they're both serving, and they're producing abstract art when they come home to make sense of it. It's pretty unique. So yeah, have a look at the Ukrainian artists, because in a way as somebody who uses words, I'm kind of amazed at what they're doing. Mm-hmm. Because you have to really distance yourself. You really have to sort of, take this huge breath to do art like that, and take a huge step back from what is affecting you every day and start to make it into something playful. And I don't mean that in a trivial way. I mean that in a very deep way. And it's easier for writers. You just at the end of the day, like in a war, everything's a story. It's pretty, it's just there. But they're doing something else. They're making sense of it. And they're reflecting on it. And they're kind of transforming it, which is the most life-giving thing you can do. So yeah, and maybe because I work with words, I'm just kind of stunned by people who can do that with art. And I'm waiting for the first symphony that's going to combine. It's obvious what it's going to do. They're going to combine the shahed sounds. This is also a sound war. We've been exposed to so many new sounds, and so many new associations of sounds. I assume that the great Ukrainian composers are already working in that space.
The sound of the FPV drone as well as
everything, but also the associations. If you're a composer, it's like there's so much to do. Mm-hmm. No, I think Ukrainian modern art is doing stuff which is sort of, oh my God, I'm going to use this word for the second time. I think, spiritually essential?
Well, we don't have an artwork to give you, but
Okay.
we're going to gift you some of our books, and this is, I'm just going to reach to it, a book called The Flood that tells the story of around the flooding of Kakhovka and the southern Ukraine, and sort of like how it impacted the lives of the communities and the people there. The author is actually serving as well, so he wrote it while being in the armed forces, and like sometimes we would like rush him, being like, can you finish this chapter? And obviously he has other important stuff to do. So this is for you. But this is something that we in our publishing house is trying to do as well, is to make sure we get writers from the armed forces as well to tell their stories. Because yes, everything is a story at war, but also it's like how you tell them and how you get them out is what makes, I guess, differentiates a popular and good story from the one that sort of like just stays unknown. So and the last question that we ask everybody here, very simple one as well, is what is your dream for Ukraine, for the future of Ukraine?
I really hope we don't forget about Crimea. And maybe it's also very important militarily. But it's, I don't know, maybe because I have many friends from Crimea. I do worry that it's...
Do you feel like it's being forgotten now?
No, well, forgotten. No, people talk about it, but you know what I mean? It's like the one, even in peace deals, it's like... I think don't forget about Crimea, and don't forget about the Crimean, the story of the Crimean Tatars, but also, I think Crimea is very important.
Yeah, I think it's very moving as well that you have such a connection to it through the people that you've met from.
Yeah, I've only been there once. I don't know it very well, actually. So I don't have that many personal associations.
Yeah, I've been there only as a child, so I very vaguely remember it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for this wonderful conversation. And hopefully we can welcome you again in 2 years or how many years. Thank you so much for watching this interview. If you want us to make more conversations like this, please support us via a link in the description. Share your thoughts in the comments and make sure to subscribe to our channel.